The discussion for tonight is the power of the cross. And while you're thinking about that, please find your places at Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter 27. And we're going to start reading at verse 50. Matthew chapter 27 and verse 50. It's funny what the word power can conjure up. For many people, that generates things from pictures of electric lights to superheroes duking it out, or maybe even a thunderstorm. But there's a different, more important type of power, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. But first, we've got to get some context. All right, so Jesus has been tried before Caiaphas, the high priest. He's been tried before Pilate. Pilate has found him not guilty. And yet, when asked if he should release Barabbas or Jesus, they said release Barabbas. And again, Jesus is beaten, he's scourged, he's marched through the city to the cross, then he's nailed there. A lot of pictures are painted with him in bare underclothes for modesty's sake. But history tells us that he was actually put up there buck nude, which for anyone would be extremely humiliating, but for a Jew especially. Then we get to the good part, as it were. The real action starts at noon that day, when the sun goes dark from noon to 3. Our time. For them, it was the 6th hour to the 9th hour. And that is where we pick up the story. A little bit further down, actually. Because Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Then they try to give him a sponge full of vinegar. I don't know. That probably didn't taste too good. And finally, Jesus dies in verse 50, and that's where we pick up the story. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. Now when the centurion and they that were with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things which they had that were done, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this was the Son of God. Now, let's dissect the scene a little bit. And first, we'll note the power of the cross over sin. Jesus was perfection personified. hear siblings complain to each other. Mom always liked you best because you're absolutely perfect. Well, embarrassingly for Jesus, that was absolutely true. I wonder what his brothers and sisters thought of that. Probably didn't like it too much. He was perfect, had done no wrong, and yet, through trickery and deceit, wound up in the most humiliating and grueling execution of the time. You may not know this, but to only live for 3 hours on a cross before you died, that was a mercy in those days. Usually, a person, if they're fit, can last on a cross for anywhere from 2 days to nearly a week. So think about that for a second. After 3 hours on the cross, Jesus said, "I'm done," and he died. That's amazing whenever you put it in context like that. And here we find the other key to why the cross, and Jesus specifically, had power over sin. He was the Son of Man. Because only a man could be sacrificed for the life of man. The law demanded it so. It's amazing how perfectly God is. Jesus is perfect, and he is man. Those two things don't normally go together. But for Jesus, they did. Because God deemed it so. God had it planned from the get-go. From before the get-go, if you want to get technical. Which is absolutely mind-blowing if you sit down and think about it for a while. And then we move to a secondary part of this picture on the cross. Christ, through his sacrifice, has power over death. Romans says, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" It is no truer than with Christ. Because if you'll note, in the passage we read, after Christ died, graves were split open. And people started walking around after he woke up. After he was resurrected, people started walking around where other people could, "Oh, is that Uncle, what's his name? I thought he died a couple years ago. What's he doing up and around?" Christ has power over death. And through his death, we, like those people in Jerusalem, like Christ on the third day, we will be resurrected as well. If we die before the time of the rapture. If not, we'll just be changed and never see death. Isn't that just blow your mind kind of stuff? Because think about it. Death is so entwined in it's kind of ironic, but our lives, that it's hard to wrap your mind around never dying. But it will happen one of these days. An entire generation of Christians will never see death. And that is because Christ has power over death, And he can say, death, you don't have any hold on this person, they're mine. Death, you can't have them. And then we move to power over atonement. That's a weird phrase if you think about it. Power over atonement. But it's true. Only Christ has the power to atone for our sins. Because like I said earlier, Christ was perfect, yet he was man. He was God in the flesh, yet 100% man. Don't ask me how that works. Many theologians have tried to figure it out since the conception of Christianity, and they still haven't figured it out. But the Bible says it, so I believe it. Christ was 100% man, therefore he could die, yet he was 100% God, so he was sinless and perfect. Thus, his sacrifice satisfied God's demands for sin since the Garden of Eden. It goes all the way back to that, because you'll note that when God gave his original command to Adam and Eve, he said, don't eat of the tree of good and evil, because in the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Since that day on, death has had power over mankind. Death has had power over every single one of us, except one person. One person. Death could not touch Jesus. God allowed death to take, Jesus allowed death to take him. You'll notice in all the accounts of the Bible, the accounts of the crucifixion, all of them, they record for us that the act of dying was completely voluntary on Jesus' part. He completely did it of his own choice. I firmly believe if Christ had wanted to, he could have healed himself and sicked thousands upon thousands upon thousands of angels on the Romans and said, you're not touching me. But thank the Lord he didn't. He could have, but he didn't. He could have just thought about it, and every single Roman in the world would just vanish. His wounds would be all healed, and he would be able to get off that cross and walk about like it was any other day. But thankfully, he did not. Thankfully, Christ had power of atonement, and he knew his duty was to atone for the sins of mankind, was to lay his blood at the feet of the Father and say, accept this, please. And God, in his righteousness, in his love, in his justice, said, yes, son, I'll accept it. Yes, son, I'll accept it. That is amazing. That is absolutely staggering. If you let it sink down real good, it'll bless you right to the core. Judgment for sin was satisfied in that one act of death on the cross. And perhaps my favorite part of this, because I'm a bit of a mythology nerd, as many of you who know me know. My favorite part of this is that Jesus, in the death of the cross, had power over idols. And you're probably looking at me like, what do you mean? Let me explain. All right. Before we started reading, the sky went dark for 3 hours. All right? In the Roman way of thinking, the sky was under the control of a god named Jupiter. He's referenced a little bit in Acts, because a few of the people that Paul and Barnabas visit mistake Paul for Jupiter. But anyway, that's a little bit of context to make sure it makes sense, because it'll make sense to me. I just want to make sure it makes sense to you all. So God is a God of the sky. He's a God who can say, all right, for this time to this time, the sun shall cease to exist. It will cease to give its light. And it was so. For 3 hours, God decreed that the sun would give no light. And it was so. And then we move to the god Neptune. And this guy, to the Romans, he was extremely feared. They hated the sea. They only went to sea when they had to. Because this guy was very nasty and he didn't like anybody. And one of his abilities, one of his epithets, was Neptune the Earth Shaker. Neptune the Earth Shaker. Let that sink in for a bit. What happened? Christ died. The earth shook. The earth shook. And God said, all right, you want an earthquake? I'll show you an earthquake, and I'll show you that I have power, that I have strength. And then we move to perhaps the most feared Roman god ever. And that would be the god Pluto. Why was he so feared? Because he's the god of death. The god who controlled the underworld. The god who basically took care of you after you died in the Roman way of thinking. The god who said, all right, you'll go here, you'll go here, you'll go here after you die. God said, hey y'all, watch this. He said, hey y'all, watch this. And what happened? Death released its grip on saints as God chose them. On saints as God said, all right, I want you to show up, I want you to show up, I want you to show up. And what happened? Boom. These people started walking around. And walking around and acting like normal people. Even though they'd been dead, they were alive again. And these specific three gods were such a big deal in the Roman mindset. They were known as the big three, the trifecta. But why is this important? Why did I go on this spiel about Roman mythology? It comes to a head in the statement of the Roman centurion. He was looking at earth shaking. He was looking at the people waking up and getting out of their graves. He was looking at the sky going dark. Remember, he's a good little Roman. He knows about the trifecta. He knows about Neptune, Jupiter, and Pluto. And he's probably looking over at the cross and saying, oh my goodness. And you can just see his eyes go, well, I don't know if y'all can, but I can whenever I picture it. His eyes just go, because this blows his mind. And you can almost feel the excitement, the fear, the unknown in his proclamation. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Whew. That's amazing. That is the power of the cross, my friends. It's better than any blockbuster that Hollywood could ever produce. It's better than any story any human writer could produce. But what's the point? The point is that if we know that this is the greatest story ever told, if we know that this is the greatest victory ever told, if we know that Christ has power over atonement, that he has power over sin, that he has power over idols, that he has power over death, shouldn't we be telling other people? Shouldn't we be telling them about the greatest story ever told? Isn't it common whenever you see an awesome movie, or at least for me it is, I don't know about y'all, that you can't shut up about it, you've got to tell everybody about it? The gospel of Christ is the same thing, only it's 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more impressive than some human-made movie, some human-made story, because God wrote it all. And God gave this precious gospel to us to say, hey, have you ever heard about the greatest story ever told? Have you ever heard about the greatest story ever written? Have you ever heard about the greatest man to ever live? That's our simple job. That's what the Great Commission is all about. Is us telling others about the greatest story ever told, the greatest person ever told. So what are we doing sitting on our hands? What are we doing being scared of ridicule, of mockery? Not everybody likes the same movies you like. Not everybody likes the same books you like. So there's going to be people that don't like Christ. There's going to be people that don't like the story of the Bible. We still need to tell them anyway. Because there is coming a day when Christ, the same one who died, historians can't agree on the date, but it's between AD 30 and AD 33. The same person who died then will look at each and every one of us and either say, "Depart from me, ye who work iniquity." That's the most terrifying sentence ever uttered. Or, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Which one do you want most people to hear? It's our duty to spread the gospel of Christ, to spread the knowledge, to spread the joy of the greatest story ever told. And that's the challenge I leave with you tonight. Spread the gospel, spread the greatest story ever told, spread the story of the God-man who broke death.